Good morning, and thank you for joining this live BSI webinar on sustainability in the aerospace industry. I'm Ann Atkinson, and I'm here today to help facilitate the webinar. With me today are our guest speakers, Brendan Hill and Martin Townsend. Brendan Hill has been in aviation and engineering for 40 years, including 26 years as a British Army officer and aircraft engineer, and serving in many theaters of operation as well as in quality management roles. Brendan has been in business assurance and certification for 12 years, 6 with BSI, where he has developed BSI services to the aerospace industry. Brendan is currently the global head of aerospace here at BSI. Martin Townsend has worked as an environmental regulator, advised UK ministers, worked with city mayors, and worked with businesses of all sizes, ensuring sustainability comes alive and is seen to be an enabler of business success. Martin joined BSI as global head for sustainability and circular economy in November 2019, and also sits on several advisory boards for public and private sector organizations to support them in their own success. So I would say you're in safe hands today with our experts. Before Brendan and Martin begin, I just want to make you aware that you have joined this webinar in a mute-only mode, so you cannot talk to each other or to us, as there are quite a few of you on the line today. However, please feel free to type your questions in the questions box in your webinar control panel, and we will do our best to answer them in the Q&A section at the end of the presentation. We will also run polls during the course of the webinar to engage with you and gain your feedback. At the very end of the webinar, we will run a survey to ask you what you thought of the webinar today. I would also like to point out that we are running this webinar remotely from our homes. So although we hope this won't be the case, if there are any technical hitches, background disruption, please do accept our apologies and bear with us. Now over to Brendan and Martin, who will kick off this morning's webinar presentation.
Thank you, Anne, and what an introduction. Hopefully we're going to make this informative. We are going to share all that experience that Anne talked about in her introduction between Brendan and I. And we've got a lot to talk about. I think, you know, where we are at the moment in the aerospace industry is a really fascinating time for us all. So we've got a lot to cover. So let's get started. So this slide for me really is all the things we want to talk about, and I think that kind of just reinforces the point a little bit that we are seeing a lot of change in the industry, a lot of positive change. We're probably going to touch on most of that, if not all of that, but so that you don't leave in any way disappointed, we've also produced a handout which is available to download. Make sure that you do that, and make sure when you do that you don't leave the webinar, because we've got a lot of really good content to kind of share with you. So if I look at that slide as a summary of what's going on in the industry, the one thing to kind of draw from it as well is, although there's a great amount of positive activity, some of those activities are actually similar to other sectors as well. And mentioned in the introduction that I worked with a number of city mayors before joining BSI, and some of the issues around connected assets and issues such as circular economy, design for adaptation, 3D printing are actually not dissimilar from what we're seeing in things like the built environment. So although the aerospace industry is moving at pace and we've got lots of good ideas and lots of innovation, some of these now are actually being learned from other sectors as well. What do you reckon, Brendan?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, historically, the aerospace industry has had a sort of conservative outlook with aircraft lives of 20, 30 years plus, and as a result, 20, 30, 40-year-old technology due to the regulations and the type certification. So the rate of change of technology is increasing, and so the regulatory frameworks are also going to have to flex to keep up. So change is inevitable. The rate of change is accelerating. So this is where we sit at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, isn't it, in terms of, and I think we're going to cover this later on in the webinar, the relationship between self-regulation and voluntary. How do we make sure the industry moves at a pace and isn't moving at the slowest pace in terms of regulation? And I know we're going to talk about that later. So, but before we kind of press on to the next slide, I think we've got a poll just to kind of make sure that all the people who are listening online are engaged in this process. So the first poll, which hopefully you're going to vote on now, is what do you see to be the main challenges for the industry from a sustainability perspective? And I'm really kind of fascinated to kind of hear your views by the way of the poll to see what you think the answers might be. I just need to, brilliant. So if you could make sure that you vote on that, and be really interesting to see where you see those key challenges to be. I'll give you a couple of seconds just to make sure that you click away. Suspense is really killing me here, Brendan. What do you reckon it might be?
Well, I think it's probably going to be the top fella.
Do you reckon so? Let's wait and see, shall we? Oh,
Interesting.
you were close, Brend, but not close enough. And it's probably also worthwhile sharing with our listeners here in terms of the fact that when we did this in the UK, we had a webinar in the UK that actually the results were slightly different. So I think that's quite an interesting message here in terms of how our listeners in terms of the US are seeing manufacturing, and actually some of those in Europe are actually seeing collaboration, but they're actually quite close to the call, really, aren't they? So I think we've got a lot to share with you in terms of how some of those issues are going to come alive. Right, so let me move on to the next slide. When Brendan and I first started talking about this webinar, we were in a slightly different world, and obviously where we are now in terms of the pandemic, it'd be wrong of us not just to take a moment just to talk about what does that really mean. And I think, you know, the way the industry is being affected is going to have a very deep-rooted kind of sort of impact on the industry, and it's almost about a state of mind, I suppose, in some respects. And there's some interesting commentary at the weekend where the CEO of Heathrow Airport said that the only way we're really going to kind of come out of where we are at the moment is to actually think about a green bounce back, a green recovery, and actually presenting it was opportunities in terms of how we think about green aviation fuels and how we really make sure that although we will have an impact and people might fly less, how do we make sure that some of the challenges the industry were looking to address are almost accelerated? So in my mind, you know, although we need to talk about sort of where we are at the moment, it is about how we then, in terms of set our mindset and how we want to move forward. What do you think, Brendan?
Yeah, because of the current situation, there's quite a significant change in that governments have effectively become stakeholders, not just from the point of view of GDP and, you know, gross national product and running the economy of the country, but as part owners or financial stakeholders. So far, the airlines industry has received $123 billion of government aid, 67 billion of which is on a repayment basis. So they are invested in the airlines. So that, of course, means they're going to want to influence the policies of those airlines, not just from the economic point of view, getting industry back on its feet and getting the GDP and GNP up, but also because they have to meet the needs of their stakeholders, the voting public. So governments are in turn influenced by the travelling public, the voters. So they need to be paying attention to the bigger global view, public opinion, and the things that they need to do to win and retain votes. So they need to reflect the mood of the population with respect to climate change, environment, custodians of the planet. So this short, sharp black swan event is going to make quite a difference.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that before, but you're right, aren't you? You know, governments will have probably a bigger say because of the investment they're making in the aerospace industry now. And that's going to change, I suppose, how things move. Things might even move quicker because there might need to be more investment. Going back to that quote from the CEO of Heathrow, you know, if these investments can be made in green fuels or electrification of airplanes, by government actually adding more money into the pot to try and accelerate and to quicken change and to support change, that's going to really change the sort of the nature of the industry, isn't it? Yeah.
It will. Well, there's the court case on Heathrow recently for the additional runway, and it was decided by the court that it didn't meet existing treaties on climate protection. So there was a legal stopper on the next runway at Heathrow.
Brilliant. Okay. Lots to think about. I've added this quote here because although I've used this in other presentations, so it's not completely current. I think what it does in my mind is kind of reinforce the conversation that Brendan and I are already having, which is it's those organizations that innovate, it's those organizations that see collaboration are going to be the ones that prosper. It can be those organizations that really make a difference, because we really need to make sure that we're moving quicker than we are, and that is about innovation, that's about change, that's about collaboration. Lots of those words which we're going to be talking about as part of our conversation today. But actually, I think the harder hitting message really is those that don't innovate, those that don't collaborate, will be those organizations that fail. And I think that's going to be an important message, as the industry starts to come out of the problems we're seeing at the moment.
Yeah, but the change in the airline business and the nature of the challenges, which are changing almost overnight, it's basically Darwin's law: evolve or die. And
Yes.
but the rate of evolution is so fast now, you can't afford to be holding back.
Yeah. No, and I think that you're looking at our slides here, aren't you, Brendan? Because you're kind of led in perfectly to this next one. You used the word evolution. The point I was going to sort of make on this one is that we need to understand that sustainability and resilience really go very much hand in hand. But the point, I suppose, that I wanted to kind of just bring to the surface, that if you look at resilience in an ecological sense, our environment is constantly adapting. It's in a constant state of adapting in terms of either kind of climate change or in terms of pollution or whatever it might be. Yet from a business perspective, sometimes we almost like to create stable work environments because it's more healthy for staff to have that certainty. And I suppose when we think about how we need to adapt, we need to move quicker. Maybe that uncertainty might creep into the workplace because we're constantly evolving or moving at a quicker pace for some of our staff. But actually, whichever way you look at it, that link between sustainability and resilience is incredibly important. From a BSI perspective, we kind of see it in 4 ways: leadership, people, process, and product. And I think that really links incredibly well to environment, social, and governance. That the kind of the 4 and 3, I think, link incredibly well together.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Change is inevitable, and there are incremental changes and sudden changes, and we've got the perfect demonstration of that. The IAQG, the International Aerospace Quality Group, has taken organisational resilience to heart, and they built it into their strategy a year or 2 ago, and that stood them in good stead during this unfortunate event. But resilience is certainly the word du jour on everybody's lips now. You listen to the
Yes.
press, industry, they're all talking about resilience. And of course, we've got a go-to guidance document, which has been around for a few years now, to help them out.
And do you think you might see different speeds of different organizations based on those that invested in being more resilient before the pandemic and those that didn't invest?
I'm sure that's the case. I mean, resilience is in some organizations in its early years, shall we say, and some are further down the road. And without that ability to flex, to change, to react, to have mindful people to deal with the sudden emergent change, then organizations won't survive. There will be organizations that fold. We've already seen airlines folding simply because of cash flow. So yes, it's inevitable that there's going to be changes, and that will also drive mergers and acquisitions, both vertical and horizontal. So it's going to change the whole sector.
Yeah, brilliant. And I think this kind of slide then leads really nicely on to what you were saying, I suppose, is that although we're kind of saying that there's a lot of improvement that needs to be made, actually the industry has done an immense amount in terms of accepting new technologies, making sure those technologies really have a positive impact in terms of what they're doing in terms of driving efficiencies. And this slide for me is a credit to the industry in terms of all that's going on at the moment. And this, I was saying to Brendan when we were talking last week about the slides in terms of what we're going to share, it's a short list. There is a much deeper, longer list of things going on in terms of, production and in terms of what's planned into the future. And I think, that's a demonstration that there's already a hunger to improve. There's already lots of innovation and technology. We're just going to probably see more of it. We're going to see, picking up the point that Brendan just made, about a quickening of the pace as well.
Yeah, there's been a lot of technological development if you look through the history of aerospace, where fuel efficiency fundamentally has been vastly increased and improved. But now we've got this emergent situation where the RPK, the revenue per kilometre, and the load factors of commercial aircraft, airliners, is totally compromised potentially by the COVID. So the load factors decrease with potentially unsold middle seats to facilitate social distancing. Or potentially they might put screens around the seats, and then the aircrew and the passengers have got to have PPE, which is all weight. So, and then you've got to clean the aircraft, the frequency and depth of cleaning of the aircraft. So in short, costs are up, returns are down. So investing in the environmental elements of it is essential, both for the short and long term.
And that kind of picks up a point that we're probably going to talk about a bit more, but the margins, I think people see sustainability sometimes as an add-on, but actually, if we think about it in terms of efficiency and driving productivity, it can actually improve the margins in terms of what you do. And I think, as you say, if we're going to fly our aircraft with less people because of distancing or people's fear in terms of, post-pandemic, that's going to become incredibly important, isn't it? Okay, and then just wanted to take a slightly different view, a different perspective, I suppose. So we talked there about kind of the design and the manufacturing side, looking at it a lens from an airline's perspective, and it comes back to the point I just made, I suppose, that there's a lot of pressure on airlines to be more competitive, more customer focused, and obviously as a consequence of that, that means that we're outsourcing more and more, which obviously in turn affects quality and safety. There's a whole load of issues in terms of ethics in aerospace, in terms of counterfeits, because people are really looking for the best product or the cheapest product. But actually, what this data, and I've used the data from the 2020 yearbook from Sam there, is demonstrating that there's some really good practice going on with airlines in terms of driving up the economic, social, environmental kind of parameters. And actually, when you look at the top of the graph, some of the lead airlines, and this represents, I think, a sample of about 32 or so airlines, are really starting to make those sort of ESG, environment, social and governance factors, fundamental in terms of where they do business, to make sure that they really are thinking about labour practices, they're thinking about passenger safety, they're making sure they have environmental policies in place. But what I think also this slide also shows is there's quite a gap between the leaders, so the top quartile and the bottom quartile. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of airlines, but I think it's encouraging that some of them airlines are really leading the charge. It is then a matter really, I suppose, of how do we share that best practice between those at the top and those at the bottom to make sure that we really make things happen in a much quicker pace.
Yeah, you can see the examples of people pressure and governmental pressure with regards to ethics and ethical production. If you look at things like clothing and sports shoe manufacturers over the last few years, where they've been increasingly under the spotlight for their methods of manufacture. And these things have made a fundamental change. So airlines, airports are all going to be subject to those influences, the personal choice of travellers, looking at greenhouse gas emissions and CORSIA and so on, and then government driving pressure with respect to climate and sustainability.
Yeah, And I think you raise an interesting point there, that one of the issues that will become more and more important is this transparency. So we see a large number of organizations working in this sector publishing data more and more. And as the consumer becomes more informed, sharing that information will affect their buying decisions in terms of who they fly with and what they do. And I think that become more and more important. So yeah, you're right. It's an issue where I think we have a slide on this later, where how the industry is perceived and how it operates and the words they use and actually the actions they take will become much more important.
Yep.
So when Brendan and I were talking about what to talk about today, one of the things we were trying to kind of get our heads around is, so what does this look like from our perspective? What does this look like from a BSI perspective? And some of the ideas we're bouncing around is that we see there to be 5 key elements, I suppose, in driving this conversation. So the work we do, the way we work with industry, the standards we write, the processes we provide in terms of audit is about these 5 boxes. So it's a relatively simple slide, but underneath it, and a lot of thoughts gone there in terms of how do we represent our sort of BSI position. If I kind of just quickly talk you through it, fundamental to what change needs to take place is good governance, and Brendan and I have already just spoken about making sure that what people say and what people do are one and the same thing, that organizations are accountable, that supply chains are accountable, making sure that that governance factor is in place. Also, if the industry is going to move at pace, it is about sound science. It is about an inclusive way in terms of using evidence and best practice to drive change. And quite often in these conversations as well, people see the sort of environmental, social inclusivity or decisions to be a burden. Brendan and I have had many a conversation over the time we've known each other about they go hand in hand. Good economics, good sustainable business model, new ideas in terms of moving from product sale to service sale. Rolls-Royce engines is a good example in terms of selling power. If you get creative, if you think about different business models, economic success and environmental limits, and making sure that you do the right thing in a way that is responsible, do go hand in hand. So these 5 boxes really kind of, I suppose, embrace the way that BSI wants to sort of land itself in this position, I suppose.
Yeah, all these things are totally linked, and you could almost draw a ring of arrows outside pointing inward, and those would indicate the kind of external pressures on all of these things, particularly the climate change agenda and so on, and government pressures. And governments cannot afford to be seen to support global polluters. Rather, they need to be supporting organizations that are in the vanguard of environmental stewardship and climate protection. And all this information is available on the internet. A lot of companies now, particularly the primes, are reporting their sustainable credentials on the internet. So you can look at Rolls-Royce and Airbus and various others who are reporting that as a key part of their persona, their go-to-market proposition.
Yeah. And you're right, on reflection, this diagram is probably too simple, isn't it? Because all those boxes are interconnected in many different ways, aren't they? They're not just a simple linear connection, that every single one connects, to drive that overall picture. And as you say, it isn't just about the internal looking out, it's about the external pushing pressure on how we operate and how, the organizations we support operate as well. But actually doing it in a way that drives, good, innovation and good culture within organizations is so important. And then this kind of, these slides fit so lovely together, don't they? Why would we do that? And we've already kind of touched upon this to some extent, I suppose, that this isn't just about value in terms of reducing waste. How do we make sure that the credentials, the value of what we're trying to do, what companies are trying to do, is about the brand profile? And then I think this slide just kind of really summarizes the fact that the value that you see from a sustainability approach, a cultural shift, a way of doing business which really takes account of environment, social and governance kind of considerations. The benefits are multiple. They are about brand, they are about efficiency, they are about innovation, they are about, if you're in the supply chain, your credentials to demonstrate you are doing what you say you're going to do. And in that means you will win more work, you will be more successful. So it's a simple slide, but I think, what we're just trying to say here is, you need to see the rounded picture in terms of why sustainability and why driving performance in a different way is so important.
Yes, it's going to be critical to the survival long term. We can't look at these things short term or in a narrow way. You've got to take that long term holistic view. The bullet one talks about operating costs, so we could talk about the simple, obvious things of load factor and RPK that we've already spoken about. But the primes now, the airframers and the engine manufacturers are looking at their supply chain now, not just for on-time delivery and conformity, but they're looking for sustainability and resilience in all its guises. It's part of doing business now, and they're going to be looking at that even more after the most recent events. So it is part of doing business. And if you're going to win passengers, they need to trust the organization that's providing it, the airline. Trust is based on image, ethics, and reputation. Those are becoming much bigger factors in supplier selection now.
Yeah. Ably put. Mindful we're probably at the halfway point of this webinar. I wanted to use this slide because I do love the 4E model as a way of almost just summarizing what we've said, but also to kind of take it to the next level as well. So when it comes to driving change, and this doesn't just relate to sustainability, this is about how we actually make sure that we are getting the industry to kind of really move at pace around some of the issues we've talked about. I see there to be 4 basic ingredients, and those are kind of displayed on that slide. And they basically are, if we are going to ensure that we are going to be better than we are today or yesterday, we need to make sure that we build capacity. And that capacity can be about new materials, it can be about new technologies, but actually there's no point talking about we want to add electrification to planes or add battery storage to planes. We need to make sure that that capacity, that knowledge, that that technology exists in the marketplace. And bearing in mind when you insert new technology, and this comes back to something we've just kind of touched upon earlier today already, is that you might need to bring in fiscal measures. So if we're talking about new fuels that we need to maybe develop within the industry, there might need to be government incentives that is about supporting the industry, as well as sort of really making sure that change is happening in terms of policy. So the conversation we've had about the relationship between voluntary, the industry self-regulating, versus the industry being driven to change by regulation, I think becomes important in that space. And the other kind of dimensions are very much around kind of engaging people, but also exemplifying. And I think by nature the industry can be slightly risk adverse. But actually, if we share best practice and we share the art of the possible, it brings confidence. People are more confident if they know other people are experimenting or they've actually used the technology and it's been successful. So actually sharing that examples or the exemplars of best practice become incredibly important if we're going to actually make the industry move forward. So I kind of see the 4Es as a nice way of summarizing some things we've talked about, but also kind of really helping us understand that it isn't about one action. We need to take multiple actions to make the industry move forward.
Yeah, so you can see this in some of the primes again. So the leadership comes from individuals, but also from companies, from organisations at the top of the tree, as it were. So some of the primes are already on the road. I mentioned earlier on Airbus and Rolls-Royce, who've got sustainability agendas. So some of them have been doing it for some time. Some of the tier ones are beginning to engage now and look at this. Sometimes they're not quite sure how to do it or where to go. but they're in the early phases of understanding what it is, how it affects them, or what they need to do about it. The other conundrum or challenge is that with the change of liquidity recently, it may be seen as an unnecessary spend. But I would suggest in the long term, and going back to that holistic long-term big picture stuff, it's an essential investment.
Yeah, good point. And this plays perfectly to the comment that Brenda's just made, that if we look at some of the comments we've made already about key people in the industry standing up and say, you know, we need to see this to be a green recovery, or we need to do things differently, that has been very much around individual leadership. But where we need to get to, we're kind of half in the individual leadership and half in the business performance space at the moment. We need to make sure that we're embedding all that we're talking about in terms of, you know, sustainable procurement or innovation, insertion of new technologies, transparency. That needs to be business as usual, because it's only when you start to actually make sure all these elements are embedded in the industry and embedded in the way that every person from the top to the bottom is working, do you start to really get true market transformation and true sort of process of improvement. And I think where we are at the moment is an interesting space where, you know, a number of leaders are really pushing this agenda hard within the aerospace industry, but we haven't actually embedded all that we're talking about from the top to the bottom of an organization.
Yes, I think the leadership point is critical. I'm very much focused in leadership in a lot of things. When I look at any new change, anything you're trying to implement, whether it's a quality management system, environment management system, whatever it is, leadership drives it. And key leaders, individuals, can make a difference, but they have to be consistent and persistent to drive it through to the desired conclusion. So, being ex-military, I would look at somebody like Churchill and the situation we had in 1938 and 39, and who would have thought that he could turn things around in the way he did it. That was an example of exemplary leadership. Or you could look at Shackleton in the face of adversity. And we're almost in that situation now. We've got COVID. We're in that kind of adverse situation. We need those strong leaders to bring us, bring the sector, bring the industry out of it.
So here's a question we haven't rehearsed, Brendan. So do you see the industry has strong leaders at the moment? So if we look at all the things we're talking about, we've got the ingredients of a great recipe, but if we haven't got leadership with the industry, do you think we will achieve it?
That's a really good question. Because I'm sitting here reflecting on it. You've put me on the spot, and I'm thinking, I can think of companies that have that. Can I think of individuals that stand out? They're harder to bring to mind. They're probably there, but they're probably, because they're at the top of a big organization, less overt. So maybe we need to change that publicity, if you like, the way they project themselves. That's a really good, thanks for that. Yeah, good question.
And just kind of taking us to the next slide. So this slide actually was from a report from the World Economic Forum prior to the pandemic, but actually what it does do very well is it kind of just reminds us that the things that were on the radar of senior leaders, senior managers, operation directors, and probably most people, is that many of the risks and many of the impacts, so the impact versus likelihood, were very much around man-made disasters, natural disasters, and you know, we've got to bear that in mind in terms of as we start to think about the conversation about resilience. You know, some of the things might be in our control in terms of how we deal with an IT kind of issue, but actually some of the things which are really quite front and center in terms of high impact and high likelihood are actual natural disasters. We probably saw that in terms of volcanoes and other events as well, where sometimes it's about embedding the philosophy in organizations to make sure that we can be resilient, we can be sustainable in terms of what we do when something is thrown at us, which is very unplanned.
Yeah, if you were to take this diagram and use it as the basis for mapping out your enterprise risk management plan, if you picked up on each of those and all the variations and permutations, and had risk treatment for each of those, then you would have an organization which is both resilient and sustainable.
Yeah.
If you don't do those, you're going to get left behind.
That's a good way of looking at it. I like your thinking there. And it's always important, I suppose, that we monetize some of these issues. And so what I've just kind of included here is some numbers which are, measured in the trillions of dollars of why taking some of these issues, some of the things that we've talked about already, seriously. When you talk about 11% of GDP, in terms of the potential cost, if you start to talk about the impact of environmental damage or the proportion of company earnings that are at risk when something goes wrong, these numbers are incredibly significant. So we talked a little bit, and Brendan mentioned it, about the business case just stacks up. And I think what this slide does in some respects is actually kind of just reinforces that point. Why wouldn't you do it when you are putting your business at risk in terms of some serious numbers?
Yeah, so we look at the current situation with 97% traffic drop, huge, short term, hopefully, margins dropping and all the challenges we've mentioned earlier on with RPK and load factors down. And there is a 50% of company earnings that could be at risk from environmental costs or ipso facto savings or financial benefits you could get from adopting sustainable practices. So it is the proverbial no-brainer.
Yes, indeed. And I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's just a sad soul in lockdown that I'm reading my weekend papers in much more detail than I normally do. But there was a great article from the IMF at the weekend where they were talking about companies. Some companies at the moment, and this does apply to this sector as well, are reporting on their climate risk exposure. And IMF was saying that if we are really going to take, the climate emergency and climate change seriously, all companies need to actually report on their exposure, because if you're investing in an organization that's not maybe taking some of these issues seriously, would you invest? And I think, that comes back to something that we've talked about already, that how do we make sure that this is seen from the top to the bottom? And sometimes the top is the investor into a sector, into a business, into a company. And actually, there's a lot of volatility in some of the investments being made where they don't see that the industry is taking it seriously.
Yeah, exactly. I just used my earlier phrase, it's not an unnecessary spend, it's an essential investment.
Yeah. Good point. You also mentioned at the start, Brendan, that one of the new stakeholders, I suppose they were a stakeholder to start with in terms of making some of the decisions around sort of the industry, but they will certainly have more weight in the future is governments. And what I wanted to try and capture here is that governments have really got a lot of skin in the game, I suppose, in terms of how the industry needs to improve and how we kind of need to make sure that the principles that need to be applied to the sector really are enforced.
Yeah, almost overnight the pressures have changed. A month or two ago, the pressures were X, Y, and Z. Now they're A through to Z complete, and there's a lot more pressure on organisations from a lot more directions, including the government input and their stakeholders and part owners, arguably.
Yeah, I think we have the full alphabet now, don't we?
Yep.
And something that we touched upon very, very quickly, but knowing that we had a slide on this, we didn't kind of dwell on it, is the point that to Brendan and I, this issue is serious to all of you. I know on this webinar it's important and serious as well. But when you start to look at the younger generation that is now coming out of college, that are thinking about what career they want to follow, they're thinking what degree they want to take up, they're thinking what company they want to go and work for. I thought I'd just introduce this slide because it really is saying that our future generations are really taking social causes, taking environmental issues, taking environmental concerns incredibly seriously. So although us as professionals that work in this space, are taking it seriously as well, future generations, this is really what they think about when they make their decisions, either their buying decisions, their work decisions, their educational decisions. And I think we just need to be very mindful of that, because those will the people will be our future customers. They will be the people who we employ in the future, and they will be driving this agenda probably even harder than Brendan and I.
Yeah, if we go back a bit to the Industrial Revolution, and the drive was purely to produce and manufacture, and never mind the environmental cost. The central part of England is known as the Black Country because there was so much pollution there, everything was covered in soot. Those days are gone because of regulation and environmental concerns, but now we're much more forward looking, and these folks that are leaving school and leaving college, that's going to be their key decision. They won't choose to work with you or fly with you or engage with you unless you meet their social agenda.
Yeah, no, well put. I'm mindful of time. We're probably sharing lots of experiences and ideas, so I just need to probably quicken the pace a little bit. So what I want to try and just capture here is some of the trends, some of the mega trends. So when we start to look at business models, we need to think about what low cost, low impact means. We need to make sure that we understand the relationship between voluntary and regulatory. And we also need to make sure that we're making the industry really exciting place to work, that it is moving with pace, it is attracting the talent from university. So almost that previous slide, people who are leaving universities are saying to themselves, what is the really sexy, interesting sector that I want to go and work in, because it's changing, it's willing to accept my ideas, it's willing to want to do things differently. And I actually think that for us to succeed, for us to kind of make sure the industry is as good as it can be, it isn't just about the leaders at the top, which we talked about for a few minutes. It is about making sure the industry really is adapting and transforming and finding new ways of working.
Yeah, the change is there for all to see. In the past, the focus of regulation has been on safety and airworthiness. There were no sustainability or environmental focus in the regulations, but now we've got things like Corsia, the gas emissions of airlines. So this is an indication of where the regulation and law and treaties are going to put greater emphasis in future.
Yeah, good point. And I think sort of leading into that, when we start to think about the trends, there are also the values. And I think this is almost a kind of a slide which embraces and just reminds us of a lot that we've talked about already. So there's a need for consistency, and that, I suppose, is the important role that standards play in this process. We've talked about transparency, because people understanding and accessing information is going to become more and more important, and that in turn means that brands are under fire more, because information is available. So saying one thing and doing something else, I think, will put more and more pressure on the brands that we've talked about before. Circular economy, we've got a slide on that in a minute, but also making sure that we really do understand that this is beyond shareholder value now. This isn't just about giving good returns to shareholders. This is about doing the right thing and giving a return to shareholders. And that process of making sure that, doing the right thing in a way that is commercially and economically viable is the balancing act that we need to pull off.
Yeah, the only point I'd pick up on is the collaboration. Collaboration is key here. It's got to be across the board, from the designers through to the technologists and scientists and so on, and all the way down through the supply chain where the various levels of expertise are. So you've got to collaborate to get this flow down and flow up and get mutual benefit of that collaboration.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. It's not just collaboration within organizations between the different departments, it's collaboration across the whole of the sector. And then, as we said earlier on, between sectors as well. There's a lot of technology that is happening in other industries that is equally applicable to the aerospace industry. So that collaboration is so broad and so important that it's interesting. It comes back to that first poll as well, doesn't it? And it's sort of like magic. We mentioned circular economy in that slide, and we've actually got a more detailed one here, but I think it's an important thing just to bring to the surface, because when we start to look at some of the trends that we're seeing in the industry, we need to truly understand, are we making some of the right decisions? Because, you know, we may want to save some weight, but when a plane comes to its end of life, have we thought about the reusability of some of those products? And it's a conversation that Brendan and I have had over the last few months about, you know, understanding the impact of decisions we make, and actually making sure that we design systems that maybe are more system related rather than product related. So can we have a service-led economy within aerospace? How do we make sure that products are easy to maintain and they can easily be extended? Maybe certain components can be reused. How do we make sure that some of those circularity principles are really embedded in the industry to make a real difference?
Yeah, the end of life has got to be part of the design, the production, and the life cycle planning. There's an old phrase of lust to dust, and that sums it up very well, right from concept through to end of life. Every element of that has got to be thought about to give it that circularity. And it's more challenging sometimes with more exotic materials, but it's got to be in there.
Yeah, no, good point. And that brings us now to our next poll. So hopefully all the people listening online will be able to vote on this next poll. And for me, it's an interesting one as well. Because it'd be interesting to reflect on what people are seeing. You know, is there what they see the definition of sustainability is against the ones we have on the screen there, but also to compare and contrast with, you know, the colleagues and the people we spoke to this morning in Europe, and see if there's any difference between the two. And it's like magic, there is the quick poll. We'll give you a few moments to vote on that.
I'm keen to see if it differs from the European one, as you said.
Yeah, we should have taken a bet on this
how. Yeah.
Not that we're betting people, of course, but it's always nice to compare and contrast, isn't it?
Indeed.
So if I'm using the technology in the right way, I'm seeing the voting numbers going up and up and up, which is healthy. So most people have voted, which is good. I think it's now stable. Yes, 80%. So that's quite conclusive, really, isn't it? That, you know, all of the above. And I'm hoping people went for all of the above because they believe that they are all the things we've talked about already. But that's good. And if I remember, Brendan, and you might need to correct me on this, that was much the same to the European kind of webinar this morning? All of the above?
Yeah, it was 76%, I think, for the European. Yeah.
See, you got a much better memory than I have. I couldn't remember the percentage, but I could visualize that all of the above was bright and yellow in this morning's webinar as well.
It was a similar result, yeah.
So I need to do some magic and bring that screen back. So I just want to kind of mindful of time now, we've got 10 minutes left. I want to leave some time for questioning. I just really wanted to cover very, very quickly something which is also important in this conversation, which is the UN SDGs. And I've kind of set them out slightly differently here from the way they're normally presented. They're normally presented as a big block of targets and icons, and it kind of plays to a lot of things that Brendan and I have talked about. In fact, we talked about it just a few moments ago, that collaboration is almost your starting point, and your finishing point is reduced inequalities, and then the route you take from A to B is actually very much down to the organization that you are. And you can step in many different directions, and Brendan and I have had different conversations with different players in the aerospace industry, and they're all selecting different UN SDGs or United Nations Sustainability Goals. And actually that's okay, because we all are different organizations, we all have different passions, we have different beliefs, and we have different impacts. And actually minimizing the impact we have, or the contribution we can make in terms of that wider context, I think is so important.
Yes, and the only thing I would add is that when you're looking at these SDGs, go beyond the obvious. Consider the indirect factors that can impact you, or upon which you can have an impact. So look at it holistically.
Yeah, good point. And then my last slide, I think it is my last slide before we have questions. I just wanted to kind of just present that almost in a different way again, which is just to kind of leave you with a thought that if we're going to see change in a market that matures, we need those three ingredients, which is about how do we get the self-regulation or the environmental regulations right, which basically push our social consciousness, make sure that we have and meet the expectations of the consumer. How do we do that in a way that actually is economically successful? And if we get those three ingredients right, that will speed up the pace that Brendan's spoken about, and it will drive innovation in a much quicker way. And so the market dynamics of getting regulations or self-regulations, meeting social expectations, economic success in terms of efficiency and all the other things we talked about, driving innovation to speed up that process, I think we will have success.
Yeah, and the leadership is again fundamental to this, and it underpins it, because leadership drives behaviours, and it's the change of behaviours which will bring sustained change, and we need to sustain this for the long term, well, ad infinitum. So that leadership underpins everything.
Brilliant. And that then brings us, and I hope you like the animations between slides, because I also spent a lot of time making sure we had an aeroplane that flew across the screen. That brings us now time for questions. I'm hoping this is when Anne drops back in and shares with us any questions that we have received from the various delegates. If not, Brendan and I can talk for forever, which you probably know by now.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you, Brendan. We do have a couple of questions that have come in. I would encourage our audience to go ahead and put their questions in the chat box. Right now, we have one that says, let's see, how do you see sustainability? How has it evolved over the past 10 years?
Wow. So you're not starting with the easy questions then, are you?
Yeah.
You're going straight into the challenging questions. I think, Brendan, that my name's on that one. I think it's an interesting question, actually. It's a good question to ask, because I think when we look back in time and we look at the first definition of sustainability, which was the Brundtland definition, it was taken by the industry to very much mean environmental sustainability. And I think, for quite a few years, that's the way we've seen it. We've been thinking about environmental protection. Where we are now, I think, is a very different space. I think the social agenda is becoming much more important. And so we're seeing the combination of environmental concerns and social concerns coming together. And people are now appreciating, and we've said this a couple of times in this presentation, that that leads to economic success. If you get that ability to engage people, to drive change, to innovate, the agenda of environmental and social and economic success really do go hand in hand. So for me, to answer the question, I suppose, I think we are at a point of maturity now where we're seeing the whole of the sustainability debate rather than just one of its parts.
The only thing I would add to that is the resilience overlay, and resilience is so important now, but they really are intertwined.
That they are, and and it's interesting when we were kind of talking about this a while back. When you look at this issue about how ecology evolves and is resilient, and how businesses evolve and sometimes isn't resilient, there was a lot we can learn from nature. But actually, it's interesting how the psychology needs to change within business as well. Any more questions? I'm sure there are out there, and there must be more questions.
There are. Hold on just a sec. Let's see. Can economic growth and sustainability coexist?
Oh, yes, that's an easy one. That's a nice one. After a hard question, you give me a nice easy one. Yes, in fact, we're doing something wrong if we are not economically successful and sustainable. And it almost goes back to your first question, Anne, as well, I suppose, that I think some companies in the past have seen sustainability as a burden. And I've seen it when I've walked into boardrooms in the past. I've walked in and I've said, I want to talk to you about sustainability, and you can see, the CFO and the CEO kind of going, oh God, the green stuff, eh? And actually, if we get rid of the word sustainability and we talk about economic success, and we talk about efficiency, and we talk about productivity, and we talk about innovation, and we don't talk about green, we don't talk about sustainability, we just talk about the outputs and the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, they are one and the same that any business will want to achieve. So I think when you understand what we're talking about and you understand how businesses, can grow and change, they are hand in hand. It's almost like the comment that Brendan just made about resilience. There are multiple things at play here, all of which fit incredibly perfectly together.
Brendan, what is your thinking on that?
I think he's covered it all. I don't think I could add anything to that. I go back to my statement. Sustainability and resilience go hand in hand. Any organization that's not resilient is not going to be around in a few years' time. And if you're not sustainable, you're not going to be around in a few years' time. So back
Very
to
true.
Darwin, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that's the first time I've ever made Brendan go quiet, which, that's my first.
What is the one thing you would do to ensure we are a more sustainable industry?
Now, that's a really good question. Do you know what? And I hope this is something that I've picked up, in the pandemic, that there seems to now be a real hunger for collaboration. And just reflecting, when you're asking that question, probably most of our slides kind of pointed that in that direction anyway. That I actually think that what we might see in the world in the future is companies going, I need to focus on what I'm good at. Some organizations have tried to do too much and spread themselves incredibly thin. If I collaborate with people that are good at what they do and I am good at what I do, I might end up in a better, more resilient, more sustainable place, because organizations are focusing on what they're doing. And so rather than trying to be large companies, maybe collaboration within the sector, between sectors, and allowing that kind of flow of information and flow of expertise from organizations that basically, are really good at doing something, might be something we might see more of.
Okay.
My answer was going to be collaborate, collaborate, collaborate. And you can look at that as no man is an island, just as no organization is an island. If you're not collaborating, then you're not resilient, you're not sustainable, you can't operate that way.
Yeah. God, we're very attuned today, Brendan.
So we have one more poll. If we could slip this in before people drop off and while they're adding more questions.
Brilliant.
So would you like us to contact you via email or a phone call about any of the following? Training, certification, product testing, software for managing standards, or you're just gathering information? Give it a couple seconds here. Go ahead.
And this is probably where I mention the fact that, because Brendan and I are so passionate about this subject, and I don't say that lightly, because it is our jobs, and I think I might have mentioned this on the first slide, is that when we talk about this webinar, the only way to do it successfully is to harvest my expertise and Brendan's expertise as one. The comment I was just about to make is that We are more than happy to have one-to-one surgeries. So as you answer that question, or in the post-event survey, if you want Brendan and I to talk to you, to talk to your company about anything we've talked about today, we are more than happy, because it almost picks up on Anne's last kind of question to us. If we're going to collaborate, we, BSI, need to help you in terms of sharing that expertise and actually understanding and making connections and showing best practice. So if you want a one-to-one surgery, if you want us to come and speak to your teams, your management team, please do not hesitate to reach out to me, Brendan, or Anne, or any of us, and ask for help, because that's what we're here for.
Great. So do we have the results from the poll? We do. Gathering information. Well, that's very good. That's very good.
So hopefully we've enlightened everybody then. So hopefully that means they're gathering information and they now feel more enlightened than they did an hour ago.
Very good. Okay, I'd like to thank Brendan and Martin for a great presentation, and you, the audience, for joining us today. We do hope you enjoy the webinar, and as I mentioned before, you'll have the opportunity to download our handouts on sustainability and aerospace after the webinar. And finally, please do leave your feedback in the survey, which we will run at the end. Thank you again, and goodbye.